Deep in the frozen wilderness of Alaska, where the towering pine trees stood like silent sentinels and the wind howled through the rugged mountains, lived an old man named Elias Boone. He was a hermit, a man who had long abandoned the world of men, choosing the solitude of the forest over the chaos of human civilization. With a past he never spoke of and a heart hardened by time, Elias had found comfort in isolation. His days were simple: chopping wood, hunting for food, and keeping the fire burning in his small wooden cabin that stood alone in the middle of the vast, snow-covered expanse. Elias had built the cabin himself years ago, using the sturdy timber of the Alaskan pines. It was a modest shelter, yet it provided him everything he needed. Inside, a stone fireplace crackled with warmth, its flames dancing against the rough wooden walls. A single table, a worn-out chair, and a bed covered in thick pelts made up his living space. The only sound that filled his nights was the occasional howl of a distant wolf or the whispering wind that crept through the trees like a restless spirit. It was a bitter winter evening when fate decided to change Elias's life forever. Outside, a furious snowstorm raged, the wind shrieking as it hurled icy flakes against the wooden walls of his home. Elias sat by the fire, sharpening his hunting knife, lost in the rhythmic scraping of metal against stone. Then a sound pierced the storm's fury, a faint, desperate whimper. Elias paused, his weathered hands tightening around the hilt of his knife. He listened. The sound came again, barely audible over the howling wind. A cry, weak, vulnerable. With a sigh, he stood up, grabbed his lantern, and slung his old rifle over his shoulder. The snow was thick and heavy as he stepped outside, each gust of wind slicing through his thick fur-lined coat. He squinted against the white fury of the blizzard, his boots crunching against the frozen ground as he made his way toward the sound. Near the edge of the woods, half buried in the snow, lay a tiny, shivering bundle of fur. A bear cub. Elias stopped in his tracks, his breath visible in the freezing air. The cub was no older than a few weeks, its small body trembling violently against the cold. It let out another weak whimper, its golden-brown eyes blinking up at him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Elias frowned. A mother bear would never leave her cub behind, unless something terrible had happened. He glanced around, scanning the tree line for any sign of the mother. The storm had erased all tracks, leaving no clues behind. He knelt beside the cub, his gloved hand hesitating above its tiny body. He knew the rule of the wild: never interfere. Nature had its way of balancing itself, and the weak often did not survive. But something in the cub's pleading eyes struck a chord within him. A distant memory flickered at the edge of his mind, a ghost of a past he had long tried to bury. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, scooping the cub into his arms. The cub let out a soft noise but did not resist. It was too weak to fight, too cold to care. Elias pulled his coat around the small creature and trudged back toward his cabin, the wind clawing at his back. Once inside, he shut the door against the storm and hurried to the fireplace. He grabbed an old blanket and carefully wrapped the cub in its warmth. The little creature whimpered but remained still, its tiny paws twitching slightly as it nestled into the fabric. Elias grabbed a pot and poured some goat's milk into it, warming it over the fire. He tore a strip of cloth from an old shirt, dipping it into the milk before gently bringing it to the cub's mouth. The bear hesitated, then weakly sucked on the soaked fabric, drinking in slow, tiny sips. Elias watched in silence, his rough, calloused hands cradling the fragile creature. He had not cared for another living being in decades, not since... No. He pushed the thought away. The past was dead. But as he looked at the cub, a strange feeling stirred within him, a sense of purpose, a quiet companionship that he hadn't realized he missed. The storm raged outside, but inside, beside the warm glow of the fire, a bond was beginning to form, one that neither man nor beast could have foreseen. That night, Elias Boone broke his one rule: never get attached. But fate had other plans. Elias sat by the fire, watching the tiny bear cub nestled in a bundle of blankets. Snowflakes melted on its fur, leaving small damp patches that glistened under the firelight. The cub shivered, its tiny body still struggling against the cold. The old man sighed. "What am I going to do with you, huh?" The cub blinked up at him, its dark eyes barely open. Elias rubbed his weathered hands together, the heat from the fire bringing back the feeling in his fingers. He had spent years in these woods, surviving through brutal winters and the dangers of the wild. He had never needed anyone but himself, and yet, here he was, sitting across from a helpless creature that had no one else in the world. With a grunt, Elias stood up and made his way to a small wooden shelf in the corner of the cabin. He rummaged through supplies, pulling out an old tin cup and a cloth. He poured some warm goat's milk into the cup and dipped the cloth inside, letting it soak. Then, he crouched beside the cub. "All right, little one, let's see if you'll take this." Gently, he pressed the damp cloth against the cub's lips. At first, there was no response. Then slowly, the cub's tiny mouth latched onto the cloth, sucking weakly. Elias felt something strange stir in his chest. He had seen animals die before. He knew how fragile life was out here. But as he watched the cub drink, something inside him refused to let this one go. Maybe it was because the cub reminded him of himself, alone in a world that didn't care if he lived or died. Or maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to be alone anymore. The cub's first night hours passed. The storm outside roared, rattling the windows, but inside, the cabin was warm. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls. Elias sat in his rocking chair, an old book resting on his lap. He wasn't reading, though. His eyes kept drifting to the cub, which had curled up into a tiny ball near the fire. Its breathing was slow but steady. He sighed. "This is temporary," he muttered to himself. In a few weeks, when the cub was strong enough, he'd take it back to the wild. That was the right thing to do. Animals belonged in nature. Not in a cabin with an old man who had given up on the world, but deep down, he knew. The moment he had scooped that cub out of the snow, something had changed, and there was no going back. The morning after the storm had passed by sunrise. Elias stepped outside, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The air was crisp and biting, the sky a pale shade of blue. He glanced at the forest, scanning the tree line. No sign of any other bears, no mother. Elias tightened his jaw. If she was still alive, she would have come for her cub by now. Which meant this little one was truly alone. He turned back to the cabin and found the cub sitting near the door, watching him with wide eyes. Its fur was still slightly damp, but it looked stronger than last night. "Guess you're hungry, huh?" Elias muttered, stepping back inside. He prepared another cloth soaked in milk, and this time the cub took it eagerly. As it drank, Elias ran a rough hand through his graying beard. "What am I going to call you?" he murmured. The cub let out a soft, squeaky growl. Elias smirked. "Feisty, huh? You remind me of an old troublemaker I used to know." He thought for a moment, then said, "Koda." The cub blinked. Elias chuckled. "Yeah, Koda, that suits you." From that moment on, the cub wasn't just another lost creature. It was Koda. And Koda was family. Teaching Koda. The days passed in a quiet routine. Elias hunted and chopped firewood while Koda wobbled around the cabin, sniffing at everything. The cub was clumsy, tripping over its own paws, tumbling into piles of firewood. One afternoon, Elias was stacking logs when Koda tried to pounce on a piece of firewood. The cub misjudged the distance and landed face first into the snow, sending a spray of white powder into the air. Elias let out a deep, rumbling laugh. The sound startled him. It had been years since he had laughed. Koda shook off the snow, blinking up at him in confusion. Elias reached down, ruffling the cub's fur. "You're a mess, little one." Koda let out a soft grunt, nudging Elias's hand. The old man sighed, staring down at the cub. "I shouldn't be getting attached," he muttered. But Koda just looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes. And Elias knew. It was too late. The growing bond. By the end of the second week, Koda was stronger. He followed Elias everywhere, waddling after him as he checked traps and gathered supplies. One morning, Elias took him to the frozen river. "This is where you'll learn how to fish," he said, crouching near the ice. Koda stepped forward, tilting his head. Elias tapped the surface of the frozen river with his knife, making a small hole. Almost instantly, a flash of silver darted beneath the water. Koda's ears perked up. "See that? That's your meal, boy." The cub let out an excited chuff and tried to swipe at the fish. His tiny paw splashed into the water, but he came up empty. Elias chuckled. "You'll get it one day." He watched as Koda tried again and again, each attempt more determined than the last, and for the first time in years, Elias felt something warm in his chest. A purpose, a reason to wake up every morning. The unspoken truth. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, one truth remained. Koda wasn't meant to stay. Elias knew that one day the cub would grow too big, too strong. One day the wild would call him back, and when that day came, Elias would have to let go. But for now, as Koda curled up beside the fire, his small body rising and falling with each breath, Elias allowed himself to believe that they had more time, that for just a little while longer he wasn't alone, and for now, that was enough. The first rays of morning sunlight streamed through the cabin's small, frost-lined window, casting golden patterns across the wooden floor. The storm had passed, leaving a thick blanket of snow over the wilderness. Inside, the fire crackled softly, the warmth filling every corner of the small, rustic cabin. Elias Boone stirred from his cot, the stiffness in his joints reminding him of his years spent in solitude. He let out a slow breath, rubbing his calloused hands together before swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. The memories of the night before rushed back as his gaze landed on the small bundle of fur nestled near the fireplace. The bear cub. It lay curled up in a ball, its tiny chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. The old blanket Elias had wrapped around it was slightly damp, and its fur had fluffed up now that it was dry. The cub looked peaceful, safe. Elias sighed. He had never taken care of anything besides himself since he left civilization all those years ago. He had long abandoned any attachment to the outside world, choosing the company of silence and nature. But now, fate had placed a helpless creature at his doorstep, and despite his hardened heart, he knew he couldn't just turn away. His stomach rumbled. It was time to eat, and time to see if the cub would eat too. Elias had always been self-sufficient, surviving on whatever he could hunt, gather, or trade during the rare occasions he visited the nearest settlement miles away. He pulled out a small pot, poured in some goat's milk he had stored in a sealed container, and placed it over the fire. The cub stirred at the scent of the warm milk. A tiny whimper escaped its mouth, and its nose twitched. Elias watched as the little creature slowly uncurled itself, blinking up at him with wide, dark eyes. "Morning, little one," he murmured, kneeling beside the cub. "I hope you're hungry." He took a clean cloth, dipped it into the warm milk, and carefully brought it close to the cub's mouth. It sniffed tentatively before licking at the soaked fabric, its tiny pink tongue lapping at the nourishment. Elias smirked. "That's it. You're a fighter, huh?" The cub drank greedily, making soft grunts and whimpers. Elias kept a steady hand, letting the cub take what it needed. As it drank, he studied it more closely. Its fur was thick, a mix of dark brown and golden hues. Its paws were small but powerful, its little claws barely protruding from the soft pads. It was a survivor. And for the first time in years, Elias felt something unfamiliar stir within him. An attachment. The next few days passed in a blur. The cub grew stronger, moving around the cabin on wobbly legs. At first, it stumbled over everything, logs, boots, even Elias's own feet. But each day, it learned a little more, becoming more confident in its movements. And it followed Elias everywhere. No matter where the old man went, outside to chop wood, down to the creek to check his fishing traps, or even just to the storage shed, the cub was always a few steps behind, toddling after him with its round, curious eyes. Elias pretended to be annoyed by the constant company, but in truth, he found himself enjoying it. The loneliness he had once embraced so fiercely now felt less heavy. One morning, as Elias was splitting firewood outside, the cub watched with keen interest. It sat near the pile of logs, tilting its head each time the axe came down with a satisfying thud. Then, without warning, the cub pounced onto a fallen log, its tiny paws smacking against the snow-covered wood. The impact sent a flurry of snow flying into the air, covering both the cub and Elias in a cold, white dusting. Elias blinked. Then, for the first time in years, he let out a deep, hearty laugh. The cub shook its head, sneezing as snowflakes clung to its damp nose. Elias chuckled, reaching out to brush the snow from its fur. "Well, you sure know how to make a mess," he said, ruffling the cub's head. "Gotta call you something, don't I?" He sat back, studying the cub as it playfully nibbled at his boot. Naming something meant forming a bond, and forming a bond meant opening up his heart, something he had long refused to do. But looking at the cub, he knew it was already too late. He thought for a moment. Names carried meaning, and he wanted something fitting. Then it came to him. Koda. The cub looked up, blinking at him. Elias smirked. "Yeah, Koda, that suits you." He reached out, scratching the cub behind its ears. "What do you think, huh?" Koda let out a tiny, happy growl before flopping onto its back, paws in the air. Elias shook his head, a soft smile lingering on his lips. From that moment on, Koda wasn't just a bear cub, he was family. The days turned into weeks, and Koda continued to grow. He became more adventurous, wandering just a little further from the cabin, but always returning to Elias's side. He learned quickly, mimicking the old man's actions, trying to swipe at fish in the creek, standing on his hind legs when Elias reached for something on a high shelf, even curling up near the fire, just like Elias did after a long day. Despite himself, Elias found comfort in Koda's presence. The loneliness he had once wrapped around himself like a protective cloak was slowly unraveling, replaced by something he had long forgotten. Companionship. One night, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the trees outside, Elias sat in his old wooden chair, staring into the flames. Koda lay beside him, his fur warm against Elias' boots. The old man sighed, running a hand through his graying beard. "Guess we're stuck with each other now, huh?" he murmured. Koda let out a small huff in response. Elias chuckled. Didn't think I'd be saying this, but I'm glad you showed up, kid. Koda didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He stretched, resting his large head on Elias's foot. For the first time in years, Elias didn't feel alone. And for the first time in his life, Koda had found someone who cared. Fate had brought them together, and neither of them would ever be the same again. As the harsh Alaskan winter melted into spring, the world outside Elias Boone's cabin transformed. The thick blanket of snow thinned, revealing patches of grass and earth beneath. Rivers, once frozen solid, roared back to life, carrying the fresh scent of renewal through the wilderness. The pine trees shed their icy burden, stretching towards the sky as if waking from a deep slumber. For Elias and Koda, the changing seasons marked a shift in their relationship. The bear cub was no longer a frail creature clinging to survival. He had grown stronger, his once clumsy steps now sure and confident. His fur had thickened, his playful nature giving way to something more instinctual. The wild was calling to him, and Elias knew it was only a matter of time before Koda would have to answer. Koda had become an inseparable part of Elias's life. No longer just a helpless cub, he now explored the land with boundless curiosity. At dawn, he would waddle down to the river, mimicking the movements of the great bears he had never met. His paws would slap the water clumsily, failing to catch the swift salmon that darted through the currents. Yet, he never stopped trying. Elias would watch from the riverbank, arms crossed, a mix of pride and sadness in his eyes. Koda's attempts at fishing were a sign of his growing independence. The old hermit knew what it meant. The bear was learning the skills he needed to survive on his own. One morning, Elias sat on the wooden steps of his cabin, whittling a small wooden figure of a bear. Koda lay sprawled beside him, his massive paws twitching in his sleep. The sun cast a warm golden glow over them, painting the wilderness in shades of amber and green. Elias glanced at the bear and chuckled. "You're getting too big for this place, boy." Koda's ear flicked, but he did not wake. As spring gave way to summer, Koda's playful nature shifted. He no longer spent hours tumbling in the grass or chasing butterflies. Instead, he tested his strength. He would rear up on his hind legs, swiping at trees, his claws leaving deep grooves in the bark. He would push against boulders, trying to move them with sheer force. Elias knew what was happening. Koda was preparing himself for the wild. One day, as Elias was chopping wood, Koda suddenly turned toward the forest, his ears perked. He let out a low growl, his muscles tense. Elias followed his gaze. Something was moving in the distance, a lone wolf watching them from the tree line. It was thin, its ribs visible beneath its fur. A scavenger, desperate for food. Elias reached for his rifle, but before he could move, Koda stepped forward. The bear let out a deep, resonant growl, one that Elias had never heard before. The wolf hesitated, and then turned and disappeared into the woods. Elias exhaled slowly. "You're not a cub anymore, are you?" Koda turned back to him, his golden eyes calm. In that moment, Elias saw the shift. Koda wasn't just a bear raised by a man. He was a bear finding his place in the wild. As the days grew warmer, Koda started wandering farther from the cabin. At first, it was just short excursions, an hour here, an afternoon there. But soon, he would disappear for entire days, returning only when the sun dipped below the horizon. Elias told himself it was natural, that it was what he had always wanted. Koda wasn't meant to stay forever. He belonged out there in the wild, among his kind. But the truth gnawed at him. One evening, as Elias sat by the fire, Koda approached him. He nudged the old man's arm with his massive head, letting out a soft huff. Elias ran a rough hand through the bear's thick fur. "You thinking of leaving soon?" Koda blinked, as if he understood. Elias sighed. "I knew this day would come." He patted Koda's side. "But you'll always have a place here, boy." That night, as Koda curled up by the fire for what might be one of the last times, Elias sat beside him, listening to the sounds of the wilderness. The world outside was vast and untamed, but for now, in that quiet moment, they were still together. One morning, Elias woke to an empty cabin. Koda was gone. The old man stepped outside, scanning the landscape. The ground was marked with massive paw prints leading into the forest. He followed them for a while, his heart heavy, but he knew what they meant. Koda had answered the call of the wild. Elias stood at the edge of the trees, staring into the depths of the wilderness. A lump formed in his throat. He had known this day would come, but knowing didn't make it any easier. He exhaled sharply. "Go live your life, boy." The wind rustled through the trees, as if carrying his words into the vast unknown. And for the first time in years, Elias felt truly alone. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and damp earth as Elias stepped outside his cabin. The leaves, now painted in shades of amber and crimson, crunched underfoot. The mornings had grown colder, hinting at the winter soon to come. Koda had grown rapidly over the past few months. No longer the fragile cub Elias had rescued from the snow, he was now a sturdy young bear, full of energy and curiosity. He had outgrown the cozy corner near the fireplace and now preferred curling up on the porch, his thickening fur shielding him from the chilly winds. Elias often found him gazing at the forest, as if something inside him was calling. One morning, just as Elias was gathering wood, Koda's ears perked up. The bear lifted his head, sniffing the air. Then, without warning, he darted toward the trees. "Koda!" Elias called out, but the bear didn't stop. Grabbing his rifle, Elias set off after him. He wasn't concerned about Koda getting lost. He had always stayed close. What worried him was the unknown. There were wolves, larger predators, and even humans who might mistake him for a threat. Elias followed Koda's trail through the undergrowth, the distant sound of rushing water growing louder. When he finally caught up, he found Koda standing on the rocky riverbank, staring into the water with wide, eager eyes. The river was alive with movement. Salmon, large and silver, leaped against the current, struggling upstream to their spawning grounds. Koda let out an excited huff and stepped forward, paws sinking into the water. Elias watched as his furry companion lunged clumsily at the fish, splashing wildly but missing every time. The salmon darted away with ease, their slick bodies slipping through the bear's inexperienced grasp. Elias chuckled. "Not as easy as it looks, huh?" Koda grunted in frustration, shaking off the cold water. But he wasn't ready to give up. Elias sat on a nearby rock, watching. He had seen grizzly bears fish before, massive creatures that barely had to try, their sheer strength allowing them to scoop fish straight from the water. Koda, on the other hand, was still learning. Again and again, Koda pounced, swiped, and even tried biting at the rushing fish. Each attempt ended in failure. He let out an irritated growl, shaking his head, as if scolding the slippery creatures. Elias sighed. "Patience, boy." The young bear stood still for a moment, eyes locked on the river. Then, slowly, he crouched, studying the movements of the fish. He wasn't just acting on instinct now, he was thinking. Minutes passed. Then, in one swift motion, Koda lunged forward, swiping his paw through the water. This time, when he lifted it, a wriggling salmon was caught in his claws. The bear's eyes widened in surprise. He had done it. Elias grinned. Well, I'll be damned. Koda proudly carried his prize to dry land, shaking the fish in his jaws before settling down to eat. Elias watched as the bear feasted, the first successful hunt of his young life. It was a defining moment, proof that Koda was growing into the wild animal he was meant to be. But with that realization came a pang of sadness. Elias knew what this meant. The more Koda learned, the more independent he would become. One day he would leave, and Elias would be alone again. After finishing his meal, Koda trotted back to Elias, licking his chops. He nudged the old man's knee, a habit he had developed since he was a cub. Elias sighed and scratched behind Koda's ear. Yeah, I know," he murmured. "You'll be fine out here." The bear let out a contented huff and flopped down beside Elias, resting his head on the man's boot. For now, he wasn't going anywhere, and for now, that was enough. The days grew shorter, and the cold Alaskan winds carried whispers of the coming winter. Elias could feel it in his bones. The air was sharp, and the night stretched longer, wrapping the wilderness in a blanket of darkness. The fire inside his cabin crackled softly, sending flickers of light dancing against the wooden walls. Koda lay curled up near the hearth, his large paws twitching as he dreamt of adventures in the wild. Elias had come to depend on the bear's quiet presence. Koda had grown into a strong and capable creature, his fur thick with the weight of an approaching winter. But no matter how large he became, Elias still saw the tiny shivering cub he had once rescued from the snow. One evening, as Elias was outside stacking firewood, he felt a strange unease settle over him. The wilderness had a way of warning those who paid attention, and tonight it was speaking loudly. The birds had gone silent, and the usual chatter of the forest creatures had ceased. Only the wind howled through the trees, bringing with it an unsettling stillness. Koda, who had been resting on the porch, suddenly raised his head. His ears twitched, his nose lifted to the air, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Elias turned to him, gripping his axe tightly. "What is it, boy?" Elias whispered. Koda stood, his muscles tensed, eyes locked on the tree line. Elias followed his gaze, and there, just beyond the dim glow of his lantern, a pair of yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness. A wolf. No, more than one. Elias could hear the faint rustling of multiple bodies shifting in the underbrush. A pack. He had lived in these woods long enough to know that wolves did not approach human dwellings without reason. They were cautious predators, smart and calculated. If they were here, it meant one of two things. They were either desperate or emboldened by numbers. Koda took a step forward, his fur bristling. Elias could feel the tension radiating from the bear. He had seen Koda defend himself against smaller animals before, but wolves were a different kind of threat. They worked as a unit, fast and relentless. Elias reached for his rifle, which rested against the porch railing. He moved slowly, keeping his eyes on the shifting shadows among the trees. The leader of the pack, a massive gray wolf with scars marring its face, stepped forward. Its lips curled back, revealing sharp fangs that glistened in the dim light. Koda let out a warning growl, stepping in front of Elias. Elias's heart pounded. He had no desire to kill the wolves, but he also couldn't afford to let them think he was weak. If they sensed hesitation, they would strike. He steadied his rifle and fired a shot into the air. The crack of the gun echoed through the trees, sending birds fluttering into the sky. The wolves hesitated, their ears flicking back. But they did not run. The alpha wolf snarled, taking another step closer. Elias gritted his teeth. "Not good," he muttered. Then the wolves lunged. Koda roared and met them head-on. The impact sent snow flying as the bear swiped at the nearest attacker, his massive paw colliding with the wolf's side, sending it tumbling. But another was already at his flank, snapping its jaws. Elias took aim and fired at the ground near the wolves' feet, trying to scare them off. One yelped and backed away, but the others were undeterred. They were hungry, desperate. Koda fought fiercely, but he was outnumbered. Elias knew he had to act fast. He grabbed a burning log from the fire pit and hurled it toward the wolves. Flames scattered as it landed, momentarily startling the pack. It was just enough. The wolves hesitated, their instincts pulling them between fight and flight. Elias reloaded his rifle and took another step forward, his eyes locked onto the alpha. "Go," he commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "This is not your fight." For a moment the alpha held his gaze. Then, with a final, lingering snarl, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. One by one, the rest of the pack followed, retreating into the depths of the forest. Silence fell once more. Elias exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. He turned to Koda, who stood panting, a small gash visible on his shoulder where a wolf's teeth had grazed him. "You all right, boy?" Elias asked, stepping closer. Koda huffed, shaking the snow from his fur. He nudged Elias with his nose, as if reassuring him that he was fine. Elias chuckled, running a hand over Koda's thick coat. "You did good, real good." That night, as Koda lay beside the fire, Elias stayed up longer than usual, watching over him. The wilderness was unpredictable, but tonight they had survived together. And as Elias sat there listening to the wind outside, he realized something. He wasn't just protecting Koda. Koda was protecting him too. The night was still, the moon casting silver light over the snow-laden trees. Elias sat on the porch, his rifle resting against the wooden railing, his breath forming misty clouds in the cold air. Koda lay beside him, his massive form stretched out lazily, his fur rising and falling with each deep breath. The warmth of the fire inside the cabin seeped through the wooden walls, but Elias couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. Then, a rustling in the woods. Koda's ears twitched. Elias's fingers instinctively wrapped around the stock of his rifle. He listened carefully, waiting. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. Koda lifted his head, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air, his muscles tensed, his eyes narrowing. Elias stood up slowly, his heartbeat quickening. Another growl, closer this time. Then a pair of glowing yellow eyes emerged from the darkness. A wolf. No, a pack of them. Elias counted at least 5, their lean bodies moving like shadows through the trees. Their eyes gleamed with hunger, their ribs visible beneath their thick winter coats. They were desperate. Koda stood, letting out a deep growl of his own. He stepped forward, his massive frame making the wolves hesitate. But the alpha, larger than the others with a scar running down its muzzle, took a bold step toward them. Elias slowly raised his rifle, but Koda took another step forward, standing between him and the wolves. "Koda, easy," Elias murmured, gripping the weapon tightly. The alpha wolf snarled and lunged. Koda met him mid-air. The impact sent both creatures tumbling through the snow. The other wolves hesitated for only a moment before attacking as well. Koda roared, swiping with his massive paws, knocking one wolf aside like a rag doll. The others circled, looking for an opening. Elias fired a shot into the air. The loud crack echoed through the forest. One of the smaller wolves yelped and ran, but the alpha remained, his golden eyes locked onto Koda. Koda bared his teeth and lunged again. This time, his powerful jaws clamped onto the alpha's shoulder. The wolf howled in pain, twisting and snapping at Koda's face. Blood splattered onto the snow. Elias fired another shot, this time into the ground near the pack. That was enough. The remaining wolves scattered, disappearing into the trees. Only the alpha remained, locked in battle with Koda. Koda shoved the wolf back, standing over him. He let out a deep, threatening growl. The alpha, panting heavily, lowered its head, finally admitting defeat. With one last snarl, it turned and limped into the darkness. Elias rushed forward. Koda stood still, his breathing ragged, his leg bleeding from a deep gash. "Damn it, buddy," Elias muttered, pulling off his scarf and wrapping it around the wound. "You saved my ass again." Koda huffed, nudging Elias's arm. That night, Elias stayed awake, watching over Koda by the fire, just like the first night they met. He had saved Koda once. Now, Koda had saved him. The inevitable goodbye. Spring arrived, bringing a fresh scent of life to the frozen wilderness. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of green beneath. Birds returned from their long journey south, filling the air with their songs. The forest awakened, but for Elias Boone, a different kind of change loomed on the horizon. Koda had grown into a massive bear, his once small paws now powerful and sure. His playful tumbles had turned into strong, deliberate strides. He no longer clung to Elias's side, but instead ventured deeper into the woods for longer periods. Elias had known this day would come, yet knowing didn't make it easier. One crisp morning, Elias took Koda on a long walk through the valley, their footsteps leaving a trail in the damp earth. The old man carried a small bag of fish, knowing Koda still enjoyed their shared meals, though the bear could now hunt on his own. They reached the edge of the great river, where the water sparkled in the sunlight. Elias set the bag down and sat on a large rock, watching the bear wade into the water. Koda lunged at the silver streaks flashing beneath the surface, his swipes more precise than ever before. He was ready. Elias exhaled slowly, bracing himself. "This is where you belong now, big guy," he murmured. Koda, dripping wet, lumbered back onto the shore, shaking himself off and sending a spray of water over Elias, who chuckled despite the lump in his throat. "You'll be all right," Elias continued, reaching up to scratch behind Koda's ear. "You're strong now." Koda whined softly, pressing his snout against Elias's chest. The old man closed his eyes, his fingers brushing through the thick fur one last time. Then, as if understanding, Koda turned. With slow, deliberate steps, he walked toward the trees. He paused once, looking back. Elias gave him a nod, swallowing hard. Koda let out a deep huff and disappeared into the wild. Koda made a deep chuffing sound, his version of a greeting. Elias turned and walked toward the porch, leaving a small pile of fish at the base of the steps. He sat back in his chair, watching. Koda hesitated, then slowly approached. He sniffed the fish, then took one in his powerful jaws, crunching down with ease. Elias leaned back, a slow smile creeping across his face. "Welcome back, old friend." That night marked the beginning of a new tradition. Every winter when the snow fell and the river began to freeze, Koda returned. He never stayed inside the cabin, never fully returned to his old ways, but he was always there. Watching, waiting, sharing quiet moments by the fire from a distance. Elias left food for him, always in the same spot, and Koda always came. Sometimes the bear would sit just beyond the cabin's reach, his golden eyes gleaming in the dark, his heavy breaths the only sound in the silent woods. Other nights he would come closer, resting near the fire outside while Elias worked on his carvings. Elias no longer felt alone. Years passed, the old man grew slower, his hair whiter, his hands more wrinkled. Yet every winter Koda returned, stronger and more magnificent than before. Then, one particularly harsh winter, Elias fell ill. He could feel the weight of the years pressing down on him. He struggled to gather wood, to light the fire, to keep warm. He knew his time was coming. One evening, as the storm raged outside, Elias lay on his cot, bundled in furs, his breath shallow. He wasn't afraid. He had lived a life of solitude, but it had not been an empty one. A sound reached his ears, a heavy, familiar huffing breath. Summoning his strength, Elias turned his head toward the door. Through the cracks, he saw a massive shadow outside. Koda. The bear sat close to the cabin, his great body blocking the wind, as if shielding the place that had once been his home. Snowflakes clung to his thick fur, and his golden eyes were fixed on the door. Elias smiled weakly. "You came back again, huh?" he whispered. Koda made a soft rumbling noise, settling himself down in the snow. He wasn't leaving. Not tonight. Elias closed his eyes, feeling a deep peace settle over him. He had spent his life running from people, from the world. But he had never been truly alone. Not since that stormy night so many years ago when he had found a tiny bear cub in the snow. As the fire crackled and the wind howled, Elias Boone took his final breath. Outside, Koda let out a long, mournful sound, a deep, reverberating cry that echoed through the mountains. And then, just as he always had, Koda remained, watching, guarding, protecting the man who had once saved his life. Because some bonds never fade, not even in death.